could just give everybody, what, like 5-minute opening statement? I guess, man. Yeah, sure. Maggie says, I think we can spin it around now. Mary, do we need to turn? Yeah, I don't think we have to be dramatic. Thank you. Care for some water, ma'am?
Yes.
Do I need to turn this microphone on?
Do you have a switch?
So y'all ready? I'd like to call this hearing to order this morning, and we said we'd start at 9 o'clock, and it's 9 o'clock right now. And I want to thank all of you for taking time from your busy schedules to join us this morning on what we consider a very important topic. We have a distinguished group of witnesses today. We actually will have two panels, and I will introduce them. I will certainly introduce the first panel right after I make my opening statement. I also want to thank the Southwest Virginia Higher Education Center here in Abingdon for providing this forum for the hearing this morning. And I'm delighted that your Congressman Morgan Griffin is here with us today and is actually responsible for us having the hearing here in Abingdon, and I want to thank him for his efforts on that. And of course, Phil Rowe is with us, who's a congressman from Tennessee, and we appreciate very much his interest in this important topic and being with us this morning as well. I will tell you that in Washington, D.C., we've had a series of hearings. In fact, today is the 25th hearing that we've held on the subject matter of energy and its importance in our economy today. And in those hearings, we focused on a lot of different aspects. We've looked at the impact of government regulations. We've looked at the impact that those regulations have on the competitiveness of the American businessmen and women in competing in the global marketplace. We've looked at the impact on prices of fuel, which always plays a vital role in our ability to compete in today's global marketplace. And this morning, we're going to be focused primarily on the new greenhouse gas regulation being issued by EPA relating to new utility plants. Now, I can tell you that when the Clean Air Act was adopted, and the last time we revisited the Clean Air Act was about 1990 in the Congress, but there have been about 3 separate occasions in the United States Congress where the issue came up of whether or not the Environmental Protection Agency, through the Clean Air Act, should attempt to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And every time that issue came up, the Congress specifically said no, that the Clean Air Act was not the appropriate way to regulate greenhouse gases. And yet, as you know, in many environmental issues, the court systems end up making decisions because a lot of lawsuits are filed under the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act is, as it is written, if a party files a lawsuit and then the government ends up paying their legal fees for them through the judgment fund, through the Department of Treasury, the Secretary of Treasury's office. So a lawsuit was filed. It went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that greenhouse gases are a pollutant. Now, if you read the definition of a pollutant in the Clean Air Act, you will see that it's rather broad and rather vague. And so it would be easy for a court to make a decision that or any other, almost any other gas would be a pollutant. So they made the decision, and then they issued something called the tailoring rule, because when they made the decision that they were going to regulate greenhouse gases, they realized that if they regulated across the economy of the United States, that they wouldn't have enough manpower to enforce this act, because it would apply to small businesses, it would apply to farmers, it would apply to all sorts of businesses and even nonprofits, because of the emission standards that they set. And because of that, they realized that we're going to have to narrow this down, which really was in violation of the Clean Air Act itself, and we're going to apply this only to the biggest utility companies. Now, we have a distinguished group of witnesses today that are going to get into more detail than I can right now. But when I read their testimony, these are all distinguished businessmen and women, and we have some coal miners with us today too. And when you read their testimony, it's rather sobering of the impact that these regulations are having on thousands of men and women who live in coal-producing areas. Jobs are being lost. And interestingly enough, when the Environmental Protection Agency issues a regulation, they always talk about the number of hospitalizations they're going to stop, the number of premature deaths that they're going to stop, the cost benefits of their new regulations. But you know what? They never, ever look at the cost of the communities where the jobs are being lost. And they never look at the cost for the families who lose their health care because they lost their job. And so it's sort of a double standard. And today at this hearing, we're going to get into all of this, because I might also say I'm really not aware of any other administration that when the president of that administration was running for office, and this president, when he was in San Francisco campaigning, made the comment that, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he basically said, our policies are going to bankrupt the coal industry. And that's precisely what they're doing. Now, at this time, I'd like to introduce your congressman, who's doing a great job in Washington, D.C. We're very fortunate to have him on the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Energy and Power Subcommittee, and that's Morgan Griffin.
I do want to begin by thanking the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Energy and Power. Hang on, didn't turn my mic on. You got it? Okay. For holding this important hearing in Southwest Virginia. Under your leadership, Chairman Whitfield, our subcommittee has led the way in fighting burdensome and unreasonable regulations that are hurting the American economy and hurting American jobs. Chairman Whitfield, thank you so much for coming to Southwest Virginia so that we might spotlight what's at stake for this region and many other regions throughout the country if these misguided regulations go unchallenged. This hearing is a great opportunity to put important testimony on the official record. People in our region understand the importance of coal. Simply put, coal powers America. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Coal generates 45% of the electricity in the United States and a much higher percentage in our area. We have the largest recoverable reserves of coal in the world. Based on current consumption levels, the United States has enough coal to last us more than 200 years. The National Mining Association estimates that coal accounts for about 94% of the nation's fossil energy reserves. Make no mistake, the EPA does have a war on coal. They've rolled out an alphabet soup of rules and regulations designed to put coal out of business in the United States. In the last few years alone, the EPA has given us the Utility MACT rule, Boiler MACT rule, Cross-State Air Pollution rule, Best Available Control Technology for Greenhouse Gases, New Source Performance Standards for Greenhouse Gases, National Ambient Air Quality Standards, Section 316B Cooling Water Intake Structures, Coal Combustion Residuals, and Regional Haze Plans, just to name a few. In Washington speak, these intertwined, insurmountable rules are called the EPA train wreck, and the American economy is what's being run over. And I'd point you to this chart behind me. Those are a series, if you look starting in 210 going forward, those are a series of the new regulations, just a few of which I just mentioned. Sadly, we shouldn't be surprised. In January 2008, then Senator Barack Obama told the San Francisco Chronicle, so if somebody wants to build a coal power plant, they can. It's just we will bankrupt them because they're going to charge a huge sum for all that greenhouse gas that's being emitted. He further went on in that interview to say, I'm capping greenhouse gases, coal power plants, natural gas, you name it, whatever the plants were, whatever the industry was, they would have to retrofit their operations. That will cost money. They will pass that money on to consumers. They will pass that money on to consumers. You know who that is? That's you and me. That's every hard-working middle-class American in the United States of America, and the president knows that his policies are passing those costs on to the people of America and apparently doesn't care. This field hearing is focused on just one of the many regulations I just mentioned, the New Source Performance Standards, or NSPS, which the EPA proposed on March 27 of this year. The NSPS proposal would essentially prevent any new coal-fired power plant from being constructed. Why? Because the carbon dioxide limits dictated by the NSPS cannot be met even by the most technologically advanced coal-fired generation facility in the country today. Furthermore, the technology is simply unavailable for any new plant to be able to meet the EPA standards. The EPA is mandating something that doesn't exist. If these EPA regulations are allowed to proceed, the impact on direct coal jobs and indirect coal jobs will be devastating. Already this year, 3 coal companies have announced layoffs in our region: Consol, Alpha Natural Resources, and Southern Coal Corporation. Sadly, these layoffs are unlikely to be the last under current regulations. Those in other industries won't be immune from the EPA's wrath. ACCCE, the American Coalition for Clean Coal Electricity, estimates that retail electricity prices will increase somewhere between 10 and 19% in our region due to new EPA rules. 7% of the entire U.S. coal fleet, or 24,000 megawatts of coal units, will retire by 2015 due solely or in part to EPA regulations. Higher electricity prices means more expensive products that are less competitive, which leads to fewer products being sold, ultimately leading to fewer jobs and a lower standard of living. Higher electricity prices are another hidden tax on the middle income earners of the United States of America that takes more income away from other necessities. The people hurt the worst are the people who can afford it least, the middle income worker in the United States. There is much at stake. I want to thank all of our witnesses for taking their time to be here today. I look forward to their testimony, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, and at this time I'll recognize for 5 minutes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rowe, for an opening statement.
I thank the chairman for yielding. Is this on? Here. I don't have a prepared statement. I just want to talk to you. I'm your next door neighbor down here from Johnson City, Tennessee, and find it a real privilege, and I thank the chairman and Morgan for inviting me here today. And in my previous life, I was a doctor in Johnson City and the mayor of Johnson City. And I can tell you, as a mayor and a local official, and certainly Representative Johnson, the dean here, can tell you, in dealing with the mandates from on high, inside the 395 Beltway became almost a full-time job. When you looked at ozone and stormwater runoff and just a myriad of things that we had to deal with on a local level. And I want to speak to the miners in here. I grew up in a union household. My dad had worked with the United Rubber Workers. He made shoe heels in a factory. In 1973, when I was in Korea in the Army, just a little south of the DMZ, he lost his job to Mexico. I know what it is to have your job exported to Mexico or to offshore. And in this country right now, there's a war on jobs. There is a bullseye on the coal industry and jobs in Southwest Virginia and West Virginia and Wyoming and Colorado and other mining areas of this country. And to me, it's unforgivable. We have one of the greatest resources in the world. And right down the road here, 30 minutes from here, Eastman Chemical Corporation uses 60 carloads of coal every day that you all produce, and a railroad takes to them. There's not just jobs in the coal industry. There are jobs in the rail industry, in the car dealerships. What I don't think this administration understands is it's just not coal mining. The coal miners here and the other people buy cars. They coach Little League teams. They do all of those things. It is your community, and your community is being assaulted right now, and we're here to see that we can stop this assault. It's ridiculous when you bring on a standard that's not attainable by any technology in the world. That means that Secretary Chu specifically is in the Energy Department has lined you up to take the coal industry out. 6 weeks ago, I was in China on a trip and viewing things there. They're opening one new coal-fired power plant every week. And let me tell you, if we don't have inexpensive energy in this country, we cannot compete. We have an opportunity now in this country to be energy independent in the next 8 years. It's unbelievable if we had a coherent energy policy in this country, and we do not. And let me tell you why it's very personal to me. I was a young Army captain just south of the DMZ in Korea in 1973 when we had an oil embargo. And the oil was cut off from the Middle East, and guess what happened? We only got heat 3 hours a day because we needed the fuel to keep our tanks running, our Cobra helicopters up and serviceable, our Hueys running, and our equipment running. It is not only jobs, it's national security is what we're talking about. And we need to use an all-of-the-above approach. Everything we have. Coal is a very important part of it, along with natural gas and along with conservation and all those things. But this particular administration has picked winners and losers instead of using the resources that we have. And what we need in Washington, D.C. is some good old Southwest Virginia common sense is what we need in Washington, D.C. Morgan, when you put this chart up, I thought that was a health care bill for a minute. It looks exactly the same. I've studied it a little more than I have that, but it looks exactly the same to me. It's all the little boxes and things go into it with a bunch of bureaucrats. I know Morgan's his first term. It's only my second term. And Ed has been here a while. We look to Ed as a leader for us because it is very frustrating to me to be in a place that I've got to tell you, there's something wrong with the oxygen blend inside 395. I can tell you the Beltway around Washington. A young woman came to my office not long ago, Donna Kessinger, who's going to speak in just a minute, and she is a miner, and made a very big impression on me. And I asked that she be on this panel. And Morgan, thank you for having her because she tells a story like no one else can about taking care of your family. That's what this is about, and about jobs. And Mr. Chairman and Morgan, thank you very much. And I know we have a distinguished panel. I'm excited to hear what they have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rowe. And now I would like to introduce our first panel because, you know, all of us are affected one way or the other by these regulations, whether it's price increases, whether it's loss of a job or whatever. But the witnesses that are going to be testifying this morning, they deal with this every single day, trying to comply with these regulations. And so we're fortunate to have these witnesses today, and I'd like to introduce them at this time. The first one is Mr. Tom Farrell, who is Chairman, President, and CEO of Dominion Resources, and we appreciate your being here. The second one is Mr. Paul Vining, who's President of Alpha Natural Resources. The third is John Voiles, Jr., who's Vice President, Transmission Generation, Louisville Gas and Electric and Kentucky Utility Energy Company. And as Phil said, the fourth is Donna Kessinger, who is a mechanic electrician at Cliffs Natural Resources and a member of United Mine Workers Local 1713, and she works in the mine. So at this time, I would like to start with Mr. Farrell, and we'll recognize Mr. Farrell for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman Winfield, Congressman Rowe. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. My comments summarize Dominion's views on the Environmental Protection Agency's proposed performance standards for greenhouse gas emissions for new coal and natural gas power stations. It's our view that the rule needs to be revised in 4 fundamental areas. First, EPA should set different standards for combined cycle gas and advanced coal stations. Second, the standard for new coal-fired plants should be at least 2,000 pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. Third, EPA must reaffirm that existing facilities installing pollution control equipment will not be regulated as new units. Fourth, the standard for combined cycle gas facilities should be no lower than 1,100 pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. It is important that this rule for new generating facilities also gives cause for concern about the direction the agency may take on expected regulation of greenhouse gas emission limits for existing facilities. The utility industry is transitioning to newer, lower-emitting, advanced coal and natural gas power stations, renewable energy sources, demand-side management programs. Smart grid technologies are playing a growing role in meeting energy demand. The foundation of America's electric generating fleet, however, continues to rely on baseload power supplied by coal, nuclear, hydro, and natural gas. Our concern is that for all new fossil fuel generating stations, EPA proposes a single emissions limit for greenhouse gases of 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour. This limit can be met by one fuel source only, natural gas, using one type of generation technology only, combined cycle. In the history of implementing the Clean Air Act, the Environmental Protection Agency has never set a single standard for all power plants. As a result, the proposed standard would eliminate new coal-fired generation, restrict the use of a major baseload fuel, and result in an undesirable national policy of abandoning coal. This outcome, however, is not mandated by the Clean Air Act, and it can be avoided. The law allows EPA to set separate standards for each fuel type. The law allows a separate standard based on the best emission reduction technology for each fuel type. The law allows EPA to set a standard based on actual emissions data instead of vendor specifications. Dominion, along with many others, has urged the agency to exercise its discretion and make these modifications to the rule. A single standard is not only unwarranted, it threatens fuel diversity, which is critical for providing reliable, affordable electricity. If we remove coal from our energy future, we will undermine our supply base, and ultimately consumers may be more exposed to unpredictable fuel prices. EPA states that the rule does not foreclose the possibility of new coal as long as they are built with carbon capture and storage technologies that are installed on the plant by its 11th year of operation. There is no demonstrated commercially available carbon capture and storage technology available today. A report issued last month by the Congressional Budget Office confirms our view that there remain legal, regulatory, and technical obstacles to deploying CCS on a utility scale. CBO found that, quote, integrating CCS technology into the production of electricity generation at coal-fired power plants appears to be more demanding technically than, for example, the use of CCS in the production of natural gas. The report concludes that without increased funding or other incentives to encourage investments, federal support for CCS will have little impact on technology deployment or reducing the cost of electricity from CCS-equipped coal plants. Achieving widespread deployment depends on a comprehensive federal strategy that includes sustainable funding and a resolution of permitting and liability issues. Simply put, performance standards from EPA will not succeed at forcing the adoption of CCS technologies. EPA should abandon that approach and set a specific standard for new advanced coal-fired plants of at least 2,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. It is also important to understand that the impact of the proposed rule extends beyond just new plants. It has the potential to create significant uncertainty about the future of existing plants. Today, our industry is planning to invest billions of dollars by 2015 or 16 to retrofit hundreds of facilities to comply with the new pollution rules. EPA must make clear that upgrading these facilities will not change the regulatory status from existing sources to new sources. Requiring these plants to meet the new gas combined cycle standard would, in all likelihood, leave only one compliance option: closure of the plant. Last week, our company, Dominion, began full commercial operations of our Virginia City Hybrid Energy Station, a new nearly 600 megawatt advanced coal station in Wise County, about 30 miles to our northwest. This $1.8 billion project employed nearly 2,000 people at the height of construction. It will generate more than $440 million annually in tax and other revenues for Wise County and employ more than 100 people. The station has been outfitted with all available pollution control equipment to achieve major reductions in sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and mercury. Our testing of mercury emissions indicates removal rates well in excess of the 90% required by the Mercury Air Toxic Standard Rule. Any future greenhouse gas standards for existing plants must ensure that plants like this will be able to continue to operate. We know that the next step for EPA is to propose greenhouse gas standards for existing facilities. It has said only that it will do so, quote, at the appropriate time, unquote. I expect this will happen either by EPA's own decision or forced through litigation. Most importantly, the new source proposal must not be the model for existing or modified source standards. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my remarks this morning. I've submitted a more detailed written statement that I asked to be included in the hearing record, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Farrell. We appreciate that. And our second witness this morning, as I said earlier, is Paul Vining, President of Alpha Resources, and you'll recognize for 5 minutes, Mr. Vining.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and members of the subcommittee, for the opportunity to testify today on an issue of vital importance to the survival of our coal industry. I ask that my full written testimony be placed into the committee record. As this committee is all too familiar, these are tough times in coal country. Alpha employers alone have reduced our workforce by over 750 hardworking men and women in recent months, and many of our industry peers have made similar workforce reductions. Mines are being idled, jobs are being lost, and as a result, many Appalachian communities are facing a reduced tax base upon which to serve their citizens. Unfortunately, the current administration, and particularly the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, continues to significantly and artificially influence our domestic electricity market through regulatory actions that hinder both the production and the use of America's abundant coal resources. I've heard some members of this committee and the broader Congress refer to these regulatory actions as the war on coal. While there is no question that our industry is being detrimentally impacted, what we are experiencing is a war on affordable electricity, a significant building block of American prosperity. And it will be American consumers, small businesses, and an already struggling domestic manufacturing sector that will pay the price for years ahead. On March 27th, the EPA released yet another proposal that will directly impact what fuel sources are allowable for use by our domestic utility sector. Commonly referred to as the New Source Performance Standard for greenhouse gases, the proposal sets output-based limits on carbon dioxide from new fossil fuel-fired power plants of 1,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. This is a standard the EPA estimates could be met without any difficulty by approximately 95% of the natural gas combined cycle units built since 2005, as well as all new natural gas combined cycle units. In contrast, New conventional coal-fired generating units would be capable of meeting this new standard only by employing the use of highly expensive carbon capture and storage technology. Interestingly and importantly, simple cycle or peaker natural gas units, which typically are used as base load power to support renewable energy facilities and which generally have a significant higher CO2 emissions rate than their combined cycle counterparts, are exempted from the proposed rule. In its regulatory impact analysis, the EPA states that this proposed rule demonstrates to other countries that the United States is taking action to limit greenhouse gases from its largest emission sources. However, the agency also states that the proposed standard will result in negligible CO2 emission changes, energy impacts, quantified benefits, cost, and economic impacts by 2020. For the sake of clarity, let me state it again. The EPA's own analysis assumes that this proposal will neither reduce domestic CO2 emission levels nor impact the economy in any way. So what's the purpose of this standard? EPA asserts that this proposed rule will contribute to downward pressure on CCS costs by shifting the regulatory landscape towards CCS. By statute, a new NSPS is required to reflect the application of the best system of emission reduction that has been adequately demonstrated, taking into account cost, environmental impacts, and energy requirements. As a technology still in its infancy, CCS has not been adequately demonstrated nor used in any widespread fashion. Until full commercial deployment is realized, power companies are extremely unlikely to spend $2 billion or more for a new coal-fired power plant whose federal regulatory compliance depends entirely on the effectiveness of an unproven technology. Put more simply, the proposed standard will not contribute to downward pressure on CCS cost, but instead will all but stall that investment. After justifying the rule as consistent with the President's goal of reducing greenhouse gases, but then admitting that the proposal will fail to accomplish any such reduction, EPA fails to rationally and reasonably explain the net effect of the proposal to effectively prohibit the construction of new coal-fired electric generation capacity in the U.S. In setting this proposal, NSPS, for greenhouse gases, the EPA decided to break from all past agency practice by establishing new fuel-neutral standard instead of one that recognizes the difference between fuel types. EPA attempts to justify this departure as warranted in light of both the emissions benefits and the changed economic circumstances, notably the lowered prices of natural gas due to technological development and recent discoveries that have boosted recoverable reserves. In other words, EPA believes that historic price volatility aside, the availability and low current market price of natural gas justifies the elimination from America's fuel mix. In conclusion, this greenhouse gas NSPS fails to adhere to the statutory limitation of adequately demonstrated emission control systems, acknowledges its failure to reduce global CO2 emissions, and unabashedly admits its preference towards natural gas over coal as a domestic fuel source. I would respectfully assert that now is simply not the time to handicap our own economic health for no discernible environmental gain, while our international competitors continue to strive for prosperity. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much. And at this time, I recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Foyles with LG&E.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee and audience guests. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to present comments regarding the EPA's proposed rule, standards of performance for greenhouse gas emissions for new stationary sources. LG&E and KU Energy is a wholly owned subsidiary of PPL Corporation and operate Louisville Gas and Electric and Kentucky Utilities companies, regulated utilities that serve 1.3 million customers in 90 counties in Kentucky and 5 counties in Virginia. Today, the companies operate electric generating stations with approximate capacity of 8,100 megawatts. That's 74% coal-fired, 25% natural gas peaking-fired, and 1% hydro. Approximately 96% of our coal-fired units are equipped with sulfur dioxide controls, and 67% of those units have SCR for nitrogen dioxide control. After assessing the impact of the most recent regulations promulgated by the EPA, specifically the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards, and the Cross-Station Air Pollution Rule, the companies developed compliance plans which were presented to and approved by the Kentucky Public Service Commission in December of 2011 and April of 2012. Those plans include installing additional environmental controls at 4 stations and replacing some existing control at 1 station. Also, the companies will retire 800 megawatts of coal-fired capacity and will be constructing a new 640 megawatt gas-fired combined cycle unit. These investments are expected to cost an estimated $3 billion and to raise electric rates approximately 14% and 18% for KU and LG&E customers respectively by 2016. With this background, we are concerned that the proposed rule would effectively eliminate new coal-fired generation from the nation's energy portfolio by setting a standard which could only be achieved by coal units through the use of carbon capture and sequestration technology, a currently undemonstrated technology that is not cost-effective under current market conditions. Today we offer 3 specific comments. 1, the proposed CO2 standard is a one-size-fits-all standard applicable to new generating units, both natural gas-fired and coal-fired. Over the 40-year history of the Act, EPA has never set a single NSPS for all fossil-fired power plants based on an emissions rate achievable only by the fuel type with the lowest emissions. In fact, in past rulemakings, EPA has routinely established subcategories based on different fuels, industrial processes, equipment, and other factors. The proposed standard assumes that CCS technology sufficient to capture and store at least 50% of CO2 emissions is available for new coal-fired units. While EPA's proposal for a framework to establish compliance under a sliding scale over a 30-year period certainly would appear to provide additional flexibility for new coal units with CCS, EPA also implicitly acknowledges the uncertainties as to when or if CCS technology will be developed. Significant technical, financial, legal, and regulatory barriers still exist to the commercial deployment of CCS. The Clean Air Act does not allow EPA to mandate a particular fuel and generation technology, which is exactly what the agency has done in requiring coal-fired generation to comply with a standard based on new natural gas combined cycle units using a specified technology. Although low natural gas prices may currently favor new natural gas plants over coal plants, there can be no guarantee that natural gas prices will remain at those levels indefinitely. Approximately 42% of the nation's power is supplied by coal-fired plants that utilize various boiler designs and combinations. As a matter of statutory compliance and sound energy policy, it is critical for EPA to set a separate standard for new coal-fired units that will permit those types of units to remain an option in the future. Such an approach is consistent with the relevant provisions of the Clean Air Act as implemented by EPA in the past and this administration's stated energy policy objective of achieving a diverse energy portfolio. Secondly, the proposed standard of 1,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour does not take into account the full range of operation normally experienced by a combined cycle unit. The proposal is based on an assumption that the standard is capable of being achieved by a unit at all times of operation, including startup, shutdown, and malfunction. Based on the extensive analysis conducted by the company in the course of planning and designing for our current combined cycle project, during periods of startup and shutdown, the emission rate will exceed the standard. Because combined cycle units will generally be operated as intermediate load units, they will likely experience regular startups and shutdowns that will pose a substantial challenge in meeting the emission standard. Finally, while extremely problematic for new facilities, a single standard for all existing or modified fossil-fired units will have an even more extreme impacts. A standard requiring each existing coal-fired unit to achieve CO2 reductions equivalent to a gas-fired unit would likely result in shutdown of virtually all coal-fired units in the nation. Such a result would wreak havoc with the nation's energy supply in terms of both cost and reliability. In the state of Kentucky and other Midwest states where customers obtain more than 90% of their electricity supply from coal-fired generation, the outcome would be disastrous to the economies of those states. Although contrary to EPA's stated policy, a single NSPS standard could also create a precedent for combining coal-fired and gas-fired units into one category for criteria pollutant regulation and subjecting those units to standards that can only be achieved by combined cycle units. EPA has stated that its proposal does not apply to modified units, but the proposed rule does not contain express language to that effect. The potential for future standards applicable to modified sources results in substantial uncertainties, particularly for units facing major projects for the purposes of compliance with CASPER and MATS, To avoid regulatory uncertainty and unintended consequences, EPA should clarify that the proposed rule does not apply to existing modified units by including clear and unambiguous language in the Code of Federal Regulations stating that the performance standards established by the proposal does not apply to existing units. Thank you for your time and interest. We've included a full copy of the comments we filed with the EPA and would submit those for your consideration.
Now, at this time, I'd like to recognize Donna Kessinger, who is a miner with Cliff Natural Resources, and we appreciate your being here very much this morning, Donna, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and other members of the committee, for this opportunity to speak with you today. It is an honor and a privilege.
Is your microphone on?
Yeah, it's on. Okay. Excuse me. I am here not as a representative of my employer. I messed up. My name is Donna Kessinger, and I live in Southwest Virginia and work at Cliffs National Resources Pinnacle Mine in Wyoming County, West Virginia. I am here not as a representative of my employer, but as a private citizen, a coal miner, and a mother that works hard for my family. I work in a metallurgical coal mine as a certified electrician mechanic, and I am a member of the United Mine Workers Association 1713. My job duties include inspecting electrical installations and equipment to ensure they operate in accordance with all state and federal laws and regulations that govern coal mining. More importantly, my job is to keep my coworkers safe by making sure our equipment functions properly. I work underground every day, and I'm incredibly proud of the work I do. When my shift is done each day, I go home, take care of my daughter. She's 8 years old. Her name is Haven. I am a single mother. Coal mining has allowed me as a single mother to provide a better standard of living for my daughter than I would be able to otherwise. The same is true for my coworkers and their family. Our jobs allow us to put food on the table, buy clothes for our children, and provide families with good health care so we can live productive lives. Coal mining makes this possible. Coal mining also provides the foundation for entire communities because it supports local businesses, which are the heartbeat that keeps many small communities alive. As many of you are aware, several coal companies have announced layoffs because of decreased market demand that has been compounded by the decision of federal regulations who have made their distaste for coal mining known, even though they are blind to the real-world economic consequences of their actions. My industry is under attack, and that means my job is under attack. America's future economic prosperity depends on the availability of affordable, abundant coal resources. Furthermore, my livelihood and the well-being of my family is at stake. As I said before, I am proud to be a coal miner. This is an honorable profession, should be respected, not despaired by those who have no solutions, just loud voices. Please help me and others like me, proud Americans who want to work hard to provide for our families. We are not asking for special treatment or handouts. We simply want to be allowed to work. Thank you.
Ms. Kessinger, thank you very much for that testimony. The insights that you provided are quite helpful for all of us, and everyone's concerned about their job and simply providing the needs of their family, and we appreciate your taking time to be here today to talk about it.
Thank you.
Now, at this time, each one of us will be asking 5 minutes of questions to the witnesses, and I would just will recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I was reading an article the other day that said that nitrogen and oxygen make up 99% of the atmosphere, and that of that, 0.00144% is man-made, and that back in 1991, when Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted, more CO2 was thrown into the atmosphere than all man-made CO2 in history. Now, I point that out simply because when Lisa Jackson, the administrator of EPA, came to testify before our committee about these proposed greenhouse gas regulations, one of the members asked her a question, and they said, that person said, how effective will these greenhouse gas regulations be? And she said they won't be very effective at all unless all the other countries in the world do the same thing. And we had a couple witnesses that made the comment that the benefit of these regulations are rather minimal. And so these proposed regulations, if adopted, in my view, will definitely penalize America and make it more difficult for us to compete in the global marketplace. Now, one of the difficulties about all of these regulations, proposed and otherwise, is that there have been so many of them coming that it's difficult to comprehend, and all of this stuff is really complicated. But I want to ask you gentlemen in the utility industry to elaborate a little bit, because all of you've mentioned that for the first time ever in this proposed regulation that EPA has issued a standard, and normally they do this if there's existing pollution control equipment that would meet the standard, that they do it for individual fuel sources, like we'll have this standard for coal because it's different from natural gas, that it's different from oil, and yet this time, for the first time, they did something different. So Mr. Farrell, would you elaborate on that?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. The Clean Air Act mandates that if the EPA makes an endangerment finding, they're supposed to regulate the various pollutants that cause the endangerment. The tradition over almost 50 years has been to the term of art they use is subcategorize the form that's causing the pollution they're concerned about. So they not only have always differentiated between a fuel source, for example, natural gas different from coal, different from oil, because they have different components to them. They actually also subcategorize even traditionally among things like coal, so that there are different standards for different types of coal, because the Act requires them to use the best available, our industry, to use the best available control technology for that particular fuel. This is the first time in the history of the Clean Air Act that the EPA has adopted a single standard, and will allow only one type of fuel to be used, which is natural gas, and will only allow one type of technology for that fuel, which is combined cycle technology. And we're not even sure, as one of the witnesses pointed out, and I did, they're basing it on design specifications from manufacturers, not on any real-world experience with the technology.
So they're not basing it on any actual emission information?
That's my understanding, Mr. Chairman.
It's primarily decided from design theories.
That the manufacturers believe a certain level can be achieved, but it has not yet been demonstrated.
Now, Mr. Vining, would you agree that when you go to regulate and you use one standard for every fuel source, which is the first time that's ever been done, that in reality, would that mean that you could never build another coal-powered plant in America and comply with that existing standard?
Absolutely, and I guess, Mr. Chairman, I'd point out two things. One, and my colleagues on either side of me could comment further, but I think it'd be difficult for any utility in this country, whether it's to be held accountable to the shareholders or to the public utility commissions, whose job it is to look after the consumers of the electricity, to basically roll the dice and invest several $1 billion in a new coal-fired power plant with having no discernible way to remove the CO2 and meet the standard that's been promulgated here.
So you know what, I walk away from that with the firm belief, and I think one of you said this, that EPA wants, at this point in time, the majority of electricity to be produced from natural gas, so that's why they developed this standard. And so we have a group of bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. that are, because of the availability and low current market prices of natural gas, that justifies the elimination of coal as a fuel mix. So the free market system is not determining this. This is being determined by decisions in the federal government in Washington, D.C. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Well, where does the time go? My time's already expired. So, Mr. Griffith, I will recognize you for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Farrell, do all natural gas combined cycle power plants meet EPA's proposed greenhouse gas NSPS requirements?
That's unproven at this point, Congressman. I believe that new designs from manufacturers believe you can reach that standard, but I think that remains to be seen.
And are you aware that certain groups that first targeted coal, such as the Sierra Club, are now targeting natural gas with their Beyond Natural Gas program as well as Beyond Coal?
I've read news accounts to that effect.
Thank you. Ms. Kessinger, I know you work in the met coal, which is a little more secure than steam coal is. But if you were to lose your job in your community, where would you go to find another job that pays anywhere near as much as what you're making now?
Well, I have no idea. 'Cause, I make pretty good money what I do, and I don't think that there's anything in this region that would allow me to make the kind of money that I do and provide for my family.
And wouldn't it be fair to say as well that if the coal mines suffer a huge layoff across the region, that many other businesses will also fail and that unemployment will most likely skyrocket in the region?
Well, yes, in my community where I work, it's in Pineville, Welch area. It would be devastating to that community because that's all they have there is coal mining.
All right. Let me ask each of you a question. The EPA maintains that the proposed NSPS rule will impose no additional costs on industry and will have no adverse impact on jobs. Do you agree with that, Mr. Farrell?
Well, I can't speak for other industries. I can speak for our industry. This particular rule deals with new power plants. We've just completed the plant here in Wise County. If this rule had been in effect 5 years ago, when we made the decision to proceed with that facility and got the air permits from EPA, from the DEQ in Virginia, permission from our state regulators, we would not have been able to proceed with the plant. That would have been that's $1.8 billion investment would not have occurred.
So it would have had an impact on you, except you got in under the wire before this rule came in?
Yeah, well, several years before, but yes.
Yes. And Mr. Vining, do you agree with their assessment that it doesn't impact costs on industry or adverse impact on jobs?
It's inevitable that it's going to have a huge impact on the coal mines and the coal miners in this region and elsewhere in this country in terms of demand for the product that we produce every day.
And I think in your testimony you indicated that you believe that with the prices of electricity going up, that would also affect manufacturers and other jobs as well. Is that correct?
I'll be a little more harsh and say that I view it as a regressive tax on every American who lives and breathes and pays bills in this country today when they turn on a light bulb.
Mr. Voiles, your opinion on the EPA's assessment that it has no real impact on, that NSPS has no real impact on costs on industry or an adverse impact on jobs?
Well, I would concur with Mr. Farrell's comments. As it applies to new units, most of the people in the utility industry aren't going to build any new coal units, so there would be no impact. We, too, have just put in service a brand new coal unit at the beginning of 2011 that, in fact, received a clean coal technology tax credit incentive from the IRS through the DOE's program in our Trimble County station. So, like Mr. Farrell, had we waited until now, that unit would not be in existence. The bigger concern, I think, that goes to the point of your question is how the mechanisms in the Clean Air Act will lead them down a path to apply this new standard to existing units, and that would be devastating.
Are you saying that perhaps if the administration gets past November and is still in office, they might feel more flexible and apply these regulations to existing coal-fired power plants?
What I'm saying is I think that there are some languages in the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 that say that they move toward existing units. The concern we have is, do they apply this particular standard based on natural gas-fired units to existing or modified units? We've just invested significant monies, and we'll be investing $3 billion to put additional controls on for the other rules that are on your chart. And those investments could become standard if they apply this CO2 standard to existing coal-fired units.
All right. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize Mr. Rowe for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding, and just to say it does matter who governs, listening to your statement, Mr. Bowles. Mr. Vining, and I know it was difficult. I know. I look at the size of this room, and I'm not sure how many people are in it, but not 750 that you've had to lay off. And that had to be a very, very difficult decision that you had to make. And what are the impacts of these rules that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis as a CEO of your company?
Well, first and foremost, the number one priority for Alpha is the safety and the welfare of the employees, and that's hard to pursue if those employees are not employed long term in basically in the job of producing low-cost electricity, low-cost energy for this country. It's the hardest thing that I do is get a phone call in the middle of the night when somebody's hurt, or I see coal stacking up, as a lot of the folks here have seen happen, and have to make very difficult decisions. And it's because of our consumer base, folks that sit at this table, and other consumers who are unable to use our product in the manner they've used it in the past.
Well, anyone can answer this if you'd want, and this is what bothers me is, as I just mentioned, that China uses more coal than Europe, the United States, and Japan put together. So it's a global commodity, coal is. And so what impact do the EPA regulations have on our competitiveness for businesses around the world? And it disturbs me that we might end up selling our own natural resources to our major competitor. That makes no sense to me whatsoever.
Well, I certainly think that if you're in the coal industry and the use of your product declines within the United States, the inclination, if you're a businessman, is to find a way to utilize your product. So I would agree that the coal industry would make every attempt to sell the product they can, and some of that would go overseas to China, and it certainly would, I think, migrate toward the thoughts that you had.
So the point is that it would have a very detrimental effect on U.S. businesses and jobs, and then global competitiveness.
I would agree with that.
Let me ask Mr. Bowles, for you, I know you're concerned, and I just met with the power distributors last Friday in Johnson City, and they're looking at this. These are the folks on the ground that have to face people when their power rates go up. And we have a lot of our senior citizens in our area that live on a fixed income. I think one of the worst things you can do, they have to pay their power bill. It's got to be one of the hardest things in the world you see as a distributor or as a producer, that when you have to go and they're behind in their power bills, how does this affect people when you have to pass those, and you have to pass those increased costs to the ratepayer like us and everybody sitting in this room?
Well,
and
certainly
you have to turn their power off, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's correct. And as I said in my testimony, the impacts of the rules, not this proposed rule, but the previous promulgated rules, is going to have an impact on our customers ranging between 14 and 18% increase by 2016. If you are on a fixed income, that forces people into decisions of where to put the money that they have that's disposable. Do you put the extra 14% to your electric bill, or do you put it to some other bill that you might need, whether it be medical, food, housing? We take very seriously and have programs established to do what we can to ease the burden and not cut people off unnecessarily. But at the end of the day, they are making choices of their life based on the money that they have and its fixed income.
See, what this bothers me is I guess the way I look at things as a physician, I look at things from a single patient. When you have these policies that are up here and you don't see how it affects the individual down here, whether it's a job loss or whether it's an 80-year-old lady you've got to go out who's a widow that you've got to cut their power off because they can't pay their bills. That's very disturbing to me. And Donna, one final question to you. I know you have a child, and you're very proud of your child. How does this affect kids in your area, the minors' families?
Well, I think it would affect them because if you're not able to provide certain things for your children, like if you're forced at or below poverty level because you're not making the money, I mean, you choose between buying a new pair of shoes or paying an electric bill. That would be a hard decision as a parent, you know, and if you don't have the money, it would be hard.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Now you go back.
Ms. Kester, I would also like to ask you a couple questions. Number one, do you work in with a strip mine or an underground mine?
No, underground.
Underground. And so when you go to work and you all are there preparing to go underground, putting your equipment on, checking your equipment and so forth, I was just curious, is there very much discussion among miners themselves about these regulations and the potential impact of these regulations? Is it something that you all discuss or do you not discuss it?
There's a handful of us that discuss it. I don't think it's really well known in the community or among a lot of miners how serious this is to us. I mean, we're working every day. We get up, we go underground, we come out, we take care of our families. And I think the average working day citizen every day, they don't have the time. I mean, and a lot of it, I mean, me personally, I'm not very political, and a lot of it isn't written in layman's terms for me, so it's a little hard to understand on certain things. But our company is making it more aware because of the Utility Act, and it will affect us, and it will affect our community.
Yeah.
You know?
We know, talking about Utility Act, this is another disturbing thing about what EPA is doing. When they first came out with Utility Act or finalized that rule, they said that less than 5,000 megawatts of electric generating capacity would be retired, and so far over 25,000 megawatts has been retired. So we think that they underestimate the cost of many of their regulations as well. We talked about this one standard, which is the first time they've ever utilized that sort of analysis. And normally, when you come out with a regulation, there is some existing technology available that you can meet the requirement. But it is my understanding, we've talked about carbon capture and sequestration, there is no commercially viable carbon capture and sequestration that you could use to meet this standard if you're a coal plant. Is there, Mr. Farrell?
No, Mr. Chairman, there is not. The theory that it would never try to speak for the EPA. I believe their theory is that they would permit a new plant, but it would have to have a functioning, commercially viable CCS, carbon capture technology attached to it, removing the carbon down to this 1,000 pounds within 10 years. I guess the theory is that by imposing this rule, that will force the adoption of a technology that does not yet exist.
Right.
So.
Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. Further complicated that I think people need to really get a better understanding on. Carbon capture is a mechanical process, a chemical mechanical process, and theoretically it does perform as it says, and it has in some other industries. The bigger question I think facing the country is, what do you do with it after you capture it? Where do you store it? And there are significant legal and property rights and all kinds of issues that have to be put in place to allow, if you can capture it, to put it somewhere. So that's a great concern that I think needs to be dealt with.
And, you know, we actually sent a letter to EPA about this, and they came back and specifically said that future coal-powered plants simply cannot meet this requirement without CCS, and there's no CCS available. So I don't know how you can walk away with any other conclusion except that EPA wants to put the coal business out of business. My interpretation. Mr. Griffith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Let me follow up on that for just a quick minute, Mr. Voiles. When you talk about the legal rights and the property rights, this is the old lawyer in me coming out. Am I interpreting it correctly that while a mining company might have had the right to extract coal, there's nothing in that original permit that allows somebody to put carbon back into the ground? Is that part of what you're talking about?
To a degree, that one of the technologies that's being investigated in research and development activities, and we participate in those research and development activities, is injecting carbon dioxide deep into saline aquifers down in, actually would be below coal mines, below water tables, upwards of, and depending upon where you live, 4,000, 8,000, 10,000 feet underground, and allowing it to fill up the pores that are in the earth and the rocks at that point. Once you inject it that deep in the ground, it propagates. It doesn't just stay in one place. It propagates laterally in that rock formation. And if you've seen rock formations as you drive through the mountains like I did coming down here, you see all different kinds of rock. It's going to propagate laterally. So it's going to go under pieces of property and across state boundaries and under rivers. And, where does it go? And will it, there's lots of technical questions about that, and certainly legal barriers, I think.
And am I correct that on a large scale, that has not been done anywhere in the world? So when it starts migrating or going places or pressure builds up, we really don't know what the long-term consequences of doing that are, do we?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Farrell, how do utilities maintain reliable service and rates when the EPA ratchets up regulations?
If I could make one last comment.
Absolutely.
On this carbon capture. There's another issue that hasn't been addressed specifically, which is you have to take the carbon from the plant to where you're going to store it. That would have to be done largely in a new pipeline system that does not exist today. You cannot use, my company is also in the pipeline business, delivering natural gas through pipelines. Those pipelines are not designed, cannot handle carbon dioxide. So you'd have to have a new system, or it would have to be removed by truck. It's another complicating factor on the legal liability around all of those kinds of issues. To your question, Mr. Griffith, all of us in the industry are extremely conscious of our customers' rates. It's our primary focus. Whenever we make a decision, and we're having to make a decision, when we build this Wise County power plant, it's almost $2 billion of investment. It's the largest single investment in the history of Southwest Virginia, in its entire history. That decision was based on the fact that we were going to be able to use that plant for 60 years. That's how long, that's our payback time. Now that's the nature of our business. That's what we do, and we're okay with that. Most normal businesses wouldn't have a long payback like that, or they wouldn't make the investment. But that's what we do. That's what we've always done. In order for us to be able to keep rates low, our company has among the lowest rates in the United States. We have been able to do that for many years because my predecessors, we've been in business for over 100 years, my predecessors that had my job made the determination the most important thing was to maintain fuel diversity. So we have very highly efficient nuclear power stations. We have coal-fired stations. We have hydro-powered stations. We have wind farms. We have biomass stations. We have natural gas. We have some oil. We have the largest pump storage water facility in North America. And it's being able to use all of those sources of energy that has allowed us to maintain among the lowest rates in the United States. And
you insulate your customers.
If we're forced into one fuel, which will take place, it'll take decades, but or at least a decade, probably two. That's going to be, I consider that to be a serious problem for the country.
I will tell you, I'm very concerned. I had one of the hearings that Chairman Whitfield held. Lisa Jackson did testify, and we were talking about greenhouse gases in particular. and their concern was, you know, that as things get warmer, you end up with more heart attacks and strokes. And I specifically asked the question, what happens when people can't afford to heat their homes, and you've got people, you know, huddled in one room with a small heater going at about 50 degrees just to stay warm because they can't afford it? Response was, well, we have programs to take care of that. But in talking with my constituents, those programs often, particularly in cold winters, aren't adequate to meet the needs. You get to late February or early March and they've run out of whatever assistance money that was there. So it's of great concern to me that the EPA does not seem to take into consideration the negative impacts on families and on jobs when they put new regulations in that have minimal impact and ratchet up the cost tremendously. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question. I have seen this same EPA with ozone when they set a standard and then of attainment, and then you reach attainment, and then they set another standard that you can't reach with current technology. So as I understand this, the EPA has set a standard that it's the ultimate catch-22. You've set a standard for one particular industry that there's no technology to reach, and then you have the audacity to say that under the proposed rule for power plants, there's a path forward for construction of new power plants. Look, I may not be the roundest marble in the sack, but I understand exactly what that is. That's just an attack on coal to remove them, and as you said, to take that one piece out of your armament that you have to keep your rates low for customers. So, Mr. Vining, is there a way forward, or anyone who wants to answer this, for constructing, maybe Mr. Voiles, a coal-fired power plant under these rules?
That would be yours. I'll make the building.
Well, at the standard as it's set today for greenhouse gases, there is no technology, as we've said here repeatedly, that will allow us to operate a coal-fired power plant in the near term. Whether or not that comes, I have significant doubt about, because why would financial institutions invest in a technology that isn't proven and is not going to be here in time for that flexibility, that 30-year flexibility that they've proposed to allow us to do that? So we will migrate as we need to add resources to meet customer demand toward technologies that can achieve a standard. And coal will not be one of those in new units.
This is what bothers me about what's going on in Washington, D.C. now, is that we're picking winners and losers. Can you say Solyndra, where you picked one particular industry, subsidized them heavily, it didn't work, it's more expensive, and yet you have a known technology that does work that you're trying to put out of business. You've created a rule. And there is something that probably, there was a law that was passed and was sponsored by Jeff Davis from Kentucky. That's probably the most important piece of legislation that's been passed out of the House. It's sitting in the Senate gathering dust. That will affect every person in this country. It's called the RAINS Act. And the RAINS Act was passed last September, and it says this: if the rule-making process, when we write rules, I'll give you an example. The health care bill is 2,700 pages long. I've read every word of it. But the rulemaking is already at 13,000 pages. But if a rule affects the U.S. economy by more than $100 million, it has to come back to the Congress for reapproval. That will do. We have to do that to rein in these rulemakers that are affecting the economy. And that's what it's doing, not the legislation, but the rulemaking process. Am I correct on that?
In my opinion, it is the implementing regulations that are written against the acts that were passed by Congress. You mentioned ozone in your opening comments, and the way that the Clean Air Act statute reads, every 5 to 8 years the EPA must reassess the standard and decide if it's still adequate. And that happens now. It has happened since 1990, and this standard would be no different going forward.
Mr. Voiles, here's a question I asked when I was the mayor of Johnson City. I said, what was the ozone level 500 years ago? Nobody knew the answer. So they may be setting a standard that it's never existed in the world. So that was a bit of a question that I thought was fairly important. What are you trying to get to? What was the world like 1,000 years ago, 100 years? Nobody knew the answer. So what you're saying to me is that there is no way forward for currently to build a coal-fired power plant in this
under
country.
this proposal for greenhouse gases I don't see a way forward in any time in the near future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
One question, Mr. Farrell. You mentioned you have this new plant in Wise, Virginia. Did you say a $2 billion expenditure? Or
1.8.
1.8. And, of course, these proposed regulations are for new plants. That would be an existing plant. So if EPA came back and applied this same standard to your $2 billion plant in Wise as an existing facility, would you be able to meet this requirement?
Not this new proposed requirement, absent CCS technology being developed within the next 10 years.
Yeah.
But with the plant that's there today, we could not meet it.
And when did y'all complete that plant?
It went commercial last week.
Last week. And how many people are employed there?
So a little over 100, over 2,000 were involved in the construction.
And $2 billion. And if they do make this apply to existing plants today, you would not be able to meet it.
Could not run the plant.
Anybody else have anything? Well, that would conclude our questions and answers with the first panel. And what we're going to do is we're going to take like a 7-minute break, and then we'll be right back. But I want Mr. Farrell and Mr. Fining and Mr. Foyles and Ms. Kessinger, thank you all very much for being with us. We appreciate your testimony and giving us very clear and concise answers to our questions. Thank you very much. I'd like to call the hearing back to order, and at this time I want to introduce the members of the second panel. We have with us this morning Mr. Dan Nation, who is the division president for Parkdale Mills, and I believe that's in North Carolina. Is that correct, Mr.
That's
Nation?
correct.
We have Mr. Joe Street, who's vice president of sales for West River Conveyors and Machinery Company on behalf of the Buchanan County Chamber of Commerce. And then we have Mr. Scott Want, who is the Director of Sustainability and Compliance with Scherer's Food, Inc. So welcome to the hearing this morning. As you know, we're discussing the proposed greenhouse gas regulations for new plants, and we appreciate all of you being here, and we look forward to your experiences and your expertise on this subject. So, Mr. Nation, I'll recognize you for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dan Nation. I'm the division president of Parkdale Mills. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this morning regarding the impact of rising energy costs on Parkdale Mills and the textile industry. Parkdale is a North Carolina-based textile company that has 28 plants in operation and over 4,000 employees in 8 states. In addition to our U.S. facilities, Parkdale has operations in 6 countries outside the U.S. in North, Central, and South America. Over 90% of our production takes place in the U.S. In turn, 78% of that production is exported to other countries. The major export markets for Parkdale are Central America, Mexico, China, and South America. Parkdale Mills is the #1 manufacturer of spun yarns in the world. Our business model centers on a constantly evolving supply chain in order to yield a faster response, better service, and continued improvements in speed to market. Parkdale also has a business diversification strategy that aims to complement our core competencies. Some of these products are sold direct to retail and include cotton balls, swabs, and pads. Our core finished product is a tube of yarn. These tubes of yarn are sold to knitting companies such as Hanes and Fruit of the Loom and made into garments that include underwear and t-shirts. We also sell to weavers for end uses such as denim and military uniforms. Yarn spinning is a very volume-driven commodity business. Textiles are some of the first manufacturing plants built in emerging economies, requiring us to compete in a growing global arena. We are constantly under pressure to lower conversion costs to stay competitive. Our conversion cost is expressed in cents per pound, which is the cost to convert a pound of cotton into a pound of yarn. The major components of conversion costs include labor, energy, benefits or health care, and maintenance. All of these are escalating, but of these, energy represents the highest percentage increase. Many of you might be surprised to learn that the largest yarn spinner in the world is located in the United States. Last year, Parkdale produced 850 million pounds of yarn, and we were the 88th largest exporter out of the United States. In order to compete against extremely low-wage countries, it has been necessary for us to invest capital in automation. The downside is that automation consumes more energy. As energy prices continue to escalate, we're losing the cost advantage of the automation investment. Yarn spinning is a very power-intensive industry, comprising 25% of our conversion costs. As a reference point, last month, all Parkdale plants in the United States consumed 86 megawatts of power, or enough energy for almost 100,000 homes. Over the last few years, our power costs have continued to rise, and we are unable to pass these increases through the supply chain. What is more concerning to Parkdale and other manufacturers is the Greenhouse Gas New Source Performance Standard, which will create even larger cost escalations that our supply chain cannot absorb. One of our plants near here is a perfect representative example of what is happening to Parkdale company-wide. In 1995, we built a 750,000 square foot spinning mill with an investment of $200 million in Hillsville, Virginia. It is still one of the most modern and automated spinning mills in the world. This operation employs 381 people and supports a substantial amount of other local jobs. We are the largest employer and taxpayer in the county. Over the last 4 years, our power cost has increased 24% in this facility. Energy cost increases of this magnitude put manufacturing companies at serious risk, as well as destroying any potential for future investment and job growth. Energy price rates have become the primary consideration for us when we evaluate where to locate a new facility. The Greenhouse Gas New Performance Standard is in fact a penalty designed to incentivize the consumer to lower energy consumption by raising their price. It needs to be understood that this strategy does not work with power-intensive manufacturing companies. Parkdale has been in the energy-saving business for years. We invest a lot of capital in energy-efficient lighting, motors, and machinery. We cannot reduce our energy demand to offset higher prices. It's not possible for us to turn off more lights at night or raise the temperature on our thermostat by 5 degrees. There is no way for us to cut consumption to compensate for the cost increase like, for instance, a residential consumer could. In fact, we contribute to overall energy efficiency by running our factories at a consistent 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, giving utilities a base capacity which lowers their cost. The only way a strategy like this could possibly work is if you punish the consumers who can do something about it if they so desire. Furthermore, manufacturing is not creating new demand or the need for any added capacity. We've been using the same amount of energy for years. It's not in the best interest of job preservation or growth to penalize manufacturing for this. We're the ones creating the jobs so the people who need this energy can pay for it. If we have to turn off lights to conserve energy, we turn all of them off, we close the factories, and people start losing jobs. These jobs end up overseas, and we never get them back. Putting higher energy costs on the back of manufacturing is one of the fastest ways I know to kill more U.S. jobs. This regulation does not solve a problem, it creates a larger one. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nation. I might also mention that Dr. Rowe has a previous appointment in his district, and when you see him get up and leave, it doesn't mean he's not interested, but he just has to be somewhere else. So, Phil, thank you for being with us today. Mr. Street, you're recognized for a 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members. My name is Joe Gary Street, and I am a small business owner in Buchanan County, Virginia. I am also a son of a Buchanan County coal miner. My children, grandchildren, and friends all have ties to coal. We are a coal mining family with our county's best interest at heart. Having lived here in Buchanan County my entire life, I am passionate about the county's current prosperity and prosperity for future generations. Buchanan County is the largest producer of coal in the state of Virginia, producing more than 9.1 million tons in 2011. With the amount of coal produced here, coal jobs make up a significant portion of the workforce. With a population of only 23,000 in Buchanan County, coal mining jobs, directly and indirectly, total more than 50% of the workforce. I'm here today to ask you to reject the U.S. EPA's proposed Greenhouse Gas New Source Performance Standard, NSPS, for utilities and explain to you the impact this regulation will have on the jobs in Buchanan County, Virginia, and beyond. The EPA's latest proposal for controlling greenhouse gas emissions will force more coal-fired plants to close when 25% have already announced closure over the next few years, reducing the amount of coal that will be produced and used in the United States. With the forced closure of power plants comes major repercussions for the coal industry. Already this year, thousands of coal miners have been laid off across Kentucky, Southwest Virginia, and Southern West Virginia. The EPA's continued war on coal makes the layoffs the tip of the iceberg for the impact these regulations will begin to have on their communities. This past Monday, one of the largest U.S. coal producers filed for bankruptcy. With this significant bankruptcy filing and the volatility of fossil fuels, newspaper headlines are rampant, and employees are scared. I've been asked in my own business about layoffs. Although our business has never laid off a single person, emotions are high even for the employees of businesses indirectly affected by the coal market. Our people are worried about their jobs and how they will pay their bills and mortgages. It was 4 years ago that President Obama told an interviewer in San Francisco if he was elected, he would bankrupt any companies attempting to build a coal-fired power plant, and he would see to it that electricity costs would necessarily skyrocket. The EPA-sponsored NSPS will drastically drive up the cost of electricity. In addition to the people losing their jobs, they will be faced with higher electricity bills. NSPS will deliberately push Americans to abandon coal, their most efficient and reliable source of energy. In Buchanan County, we simply cannot afford to abandon coal. Already, we've tried to diversify our economy with manufacturing jobs. The geographical location and the lack of flat land makes it nearly impossible. The population is so dependent on coal that if we were to abandon it, the only word to describe Buchanan County would be devastation. Buchanan County receives $46 million per year in severance tax from coal, natural gas, and other related coal taxes per 2013 budget, Buchanan County. The county only receives a total of $60 million from all county sources, excluding federal and state. This $60 million figure includes the severance tax, including property tax, local sales tax, and use tax, revenue from waste removal. The major county expenses total between 55 and 60, could go as high as $65 million. In order to survive, if fossil fuels are abandoned, major cuts will have to be made. These cuts will come from a large majority of people who do not have jobs. President Obama allegedly supports an all of the above energy policy, as he stated in his address to the American people in January. However, fossil fuels were left out of that policy. Currently, there is no energy policy from the executive branch that includes fossil fuels. I feel that it's my responsibility to speak on behalf of the citizens of Buchanan County so that everyone understands what is at stake if EPA continues on the convoy of regulatory train wrecks that are rolling across America. We are only one of thousands of communities across our country that will suffer. Counties in Kentucky, southern West Virginia will suffer even worse than Buchanan County because they have higher populations of coal and coal-related jobs. If President Obama's energy policy is all the above, shouldn't he be putting taxpayers' dollars into things like carbon storage research and ways to continue to cut down on CO2 emissions rather than pumping taxpayers' dollars into unprofitable solar energy? Coal is the most economical, abundant, and reliable source of energy that we have in this country. Why are we not focusing on making this affordable resource better? NSPS impact on our country is beyond describable. The facts presented in the statement do not begin to summarize the devastating effect the NSPS will have. As a business owner, how do you explain to your employees why they're losing their job? Do you tell them it's because we have a government who forgot about the people of Appalachia and their livelihood? I'm telling you all this because I see and read every single day firsthand what EPA regulations are doing to the communities throughout Appalachia, and particularly in Buchanan County. I'm here to ask you to say no to the proposed NSPS. Thank you, and I'll answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Street. We appreciate your testimony. Mr. Wyatt, you're recognized for a 5-minute opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in your proceedings. Over the course of 35 years, Shears has grown from a single-family-owned delivery truck to what is truly an American success story. Recognized as the nation's largest manufacturer of kettle chips, Shears also proudly produces standard potato, tortilla, multigrain, and extruded chip products. Shears currently employs nearly 2,000 individuals, with total manufacturing space of over 1 million square feet in 5 states: Ohio, Texas, Oregon, and Virginia. Today, I would like to share our concerns regarding potential changes in EPA, greenhouse gas reporting, and tailoring rules, and the resulting impacts on our industry. if the Clean Air Act CO2 trigger points are lowered from 100,000 tons per year to suggested values such as 250 tons, all 5 of Shear's sites would be subject to expensive and unnecessary Title V requirements, as well as those associated with PSD regulations. In a fiercely competitive market where margins are accumulated in pennies and not dollars, the cost and compliance burdens associated with these sites would be substantial and cannot be underestimated. Shears does recognize a concern for the results of growing greenhouse gas concentration levels, but believes that our industry's greatest ability to positively impact these concerns comes through the proactive and voluntary management of sustainability and energy reduction programs, rather than through mandated government intervention and increased regulation. Substantial participation in previous programs, such as Climate Leaders, has indicated our industry's willingness to accept proportionate accountability and to effect positive change in a voluntary manner. To discuss real change, it's been my pleasure in working with our CEO, Bob Scheer, and our president, Scott Smith, as well as all of our Shears associates, in creating a culture of sustainability and corporate social responsibility, one that embraces the communities and environments in which we reside and operate. With energy and greenhouse gas tracking programs in place since 2007, Shears elevated its commitment to this program in 2009 with the design and construction of our new facility in Massillon, Ohio, under the guidelines of the United States Green Building Council's LEED program, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. Shortly following the commissioning of this building in June of 2010, the site was recognized with the highest honor, the certification of platinum. With this, it was the only plant, the only manufacturing plant in the United States, and the only food manufacturing plant in the world to receive this honor. In order to participate in this certification, Shears was required to establish not only baseline values for energy use in our industry, but also demonstrate a total energy intensity reduction of at least 14%. Like other manufacturers, the large portion of our energy consumed is in our manufacturing, over 83%. That comes in the form of natural gas and electric that we use in the processes of cooking, baking, and frying our products. Shears was only able to achieve the required intensity reductions through the redesign and reconstruction of our basic processes. The resulting innovations resulted in patent-pending designs for new ovens, heat recovery systems, and the recycling of energy in our plants. In summary, the site was measured and verified to use over 30% less total energy than our comparative plants. This site was funded without any federal grants or contracts or any additional investment. Shears had to go to the level of investing 5.5% of the total project cost to hit these goals. However, the business case was there and a return on investment was made within less than 3 years. As a result, these innovations and enhancements are being passed on to our other facilities. Future market impacts. In simplest terms, Shears manufacturing relies on 3 primary ingredients: labor, energy in the form of natural gas and electric, and agriculture, potatoes, corn, and grain. Shears has already witnessed shifts in our supply chain, indicating the outcomes of greenhouse gas will continue to impact our supply chain moving forward. Shears is very sensitive to fluctuation in energy markets as well, where even small changes can result in devastating impacts. Our largest plants maintain yearly budgets of $5 million for natural gas and over $2 million in electric costs. Shears' ability to consider the potential benefits of sustainable projects such as cogeneration to offset these energy costs have been severely limited by the uncertainty surrounding these established thresholds and the potential for the EPA to drop these triggers. In conclusion, Shears continues to proactively push the efficiencies of our processes, lowering energy use and associated greenhouse gas emissions. It's our belief that any attempts to control or reduce the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions must both be scientifically sound as well as economically sustainable. This must be executed in a stepped and methodical approach and with the involvement of affected industry partners. Shears would like to thank the subcommittee for its consideration of this important issue, and accompanying our formal statement, we're open to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. White. We appreciate that, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Street, you mentioned about the President being committed to an all-of-the-above energy policy, and I might say that when he developed his campaign website about 5 months ago, we were looking at the website, and every source of fuel was mentioned in that website except for coal. And we wrote a letter, and they actually put coal back in, but I think the actions of his administration indicate that while it might be on the campaign website, they don't have any intention of doing anything to facilitate the additional use of coal. Now, Mr. Nation, you and Mr. White are both involved in manufacturing, and the President talks frequently about the need to rebuild manufacturing and create new manufacturing jobs in America. And your company, Parkdale Mills, Mr. Nation, you said is the largest spun yarn facility and company in the world. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you have, is it 4,000 employees?
Just over 4,000 employees.
Yeah. And you
28
operate
plants.
in 6 countries in addition to the U.S., correct?
That's correct.
But most of your production comes from the U.S., right?
90%. That's right.
And how many employees did you say you all had, Mr. White?
Just under 2,000.
2,000. Now, if this greenhouse gas rule is finalized, the previous panel, the CEOs of these major utility companies all indicated that prices are going to go up for fuel, for electricity. And both of you seem to be saying that there's very little that you can do to reduce the amount of electricity that you need. Is that correct?
There's very little we can do at all. Our factories run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We have to control our atmospheric conditions, and we have to run every motor on every machine, just like he said, to try to make pennies when you spend millions of dollars, because we're a commodity business. We have no way to lower our energy costs anymore.
So if, and to set aside the question of reliability, because everyone's quite concerned about the reliability issue of whether you can get the electricity you need, but just focusing on the price, if these actually go into effect and then they also take it down to existing power plants, that's going to be devastating to your companies, isn't it?
It will. It could easily result in job loss. It certainly will stop future investments, and we're in business to make a profit. We have to go where we can make a profit. And if the energy costs are prohibitive, we can't do it.
Well, I know that in Kentucky, where I'm from, we have some big aluminum plants there that have indicated that their margins are so low that if these electricity prices continue to go up, that they will move their facilities to Canada. And if you can't economically compete here in the U.S., then you either have to decide, I suppose, to go out of business or go somewhere else. Is that correct?
Those are basically your options. That's right.
You agree with that, Mr. White?
That would present significant challenges for Shears. Currently, electricity is the smaller portion of the two energies that we use. Again, per our discussion, frying, baking, those are the processes we use, which are very natural gas intensive.
Well, now baking, we've had bakers come to Washington and testify about the impact that greenhouse gas regulations will have on them from their emissions standards.
And that's the bigger concern for Shears when I talk about Title V permitting, is that the rules as described, the first panel was energy producers in terms of a supply chain to us. But the rules also could roll down if the limits are lowered significantly. They could impact us directly in terms of the air permits that we manage for our equipment, which does combust natural gas. Ultimately, asking us to report on our greenhouse gas emissions, or could eventually cap or limit
Absolutely.
how much production we could use.
I mean, that's a real threat, because under the Clean Air Act, as it exists today, EPA has a responsibility and a legal obligation to enforce emissions under their new proposed regulation to much smaller companies. I mean, the new source performance standard is focused on larger utility companies, but if they literally abided by the statute, and they've indicated that eventually they're going to go down to smaller facilities, that it would directly impact you on your emissions. So this could get even much worse than it already is. And that's why we're doing everything that we can do to try to prevent EPA from finalizing this rule. So this time I recognize Mr. Griffith for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me follow up on that, because I do think that's important, and you referenced if the EPA lowers it. In reality, the Clean Air Act calls for that 250-ton standard, and they have unilaterally on their own changed the law, and they got a D.C. Circuit Court to agree with them that that's because if you apply what the Congress wrote back in the 90s to greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, it's not doable. That being said, though, there is a suit that is going to be appealed from the D.C. Circuit on up, and that suit claims that they don't have the power to what they call tailor the rule. And I would have to agree with you that it would be hard on a lot of businesses in this country should the actual law be applied. It wasn't the members of Congress who made that decision that 250 tons was the law that they wrote, but they never put the words greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide. And in fact, Mr. Chairman, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe even the man who wrote the bill, Congressman Dingell, has said they never anticipated that it would apply to carbon dioxide. Am I correct on that? I yield.
In fact, when they had a conference between the Senate and the House, when the Clean Air Act was last amended in 1990, one of the members was told, introduced an amendment to allow greenhouse gases to be regulated, and they would not accept it.
So that's where that problem comes in. So it's not just the EPA that may make a decision to lower. It may actually be the courts that ultimately determine that they have no choice but to lower that standard, thus affecting business. And that's why there's so much concern over this particular regulation, because it's not just the current effects we heard about on the last panel or the effects we've heard on this panel. It's the future effects if they actually implement the law to the way it was actually written originally. Mr. Street, let me ask you this. I know that you're here today representing the Buchanan County Chamber, but you also are a manufacturer, are you not?
That's correct.
And you manufacture conveyor belts, if I remember correctly, and other items for the coal industry?
We actually build the conveyors. We do not build the belts.
Okay.
Except we build all the terminal groups and I've been in business since 1981 with another partner.
And go ahead.
We service the coal industry. Probably 75 to somewhere to 80% will be directly shipped to the coal industry this year. And some of the people here, we ship to all the major companies throughout the United States.
And one of your customers is, in fact, Patriot Coal that went bankrupt last week?
That's correct.
And that's part of the reason why your employees are very concerned about whether or not they're going to have jobs in the months to come. Is that true?
Well, what happened on Tuesday morning, we suspended all their orders going to Patriot Coal. And naturally, you send it out in your worksheets that we've stopped. We put those back and put other orders ahead of those. Until our employees became very, very concerned about what's going on. And with the internet, they found out that Patriot had filed bankruptcy, in which I know the regulations and compounded with EPA and investors not wanting to invest in the coal industry, as per se that the coal-fired plants are being shut down, and the steam market is in devastation. The first thing I heard, as a matter of fact, I was on their property in West Virginia on Monday, and first thing I heard on Tuesday morning, what's going on? Do we still have a job? And naturally, we sell to other companies throughout the industry. And I reassured them, and then with the announcement that they did have financing as DIP financing in Chapter 11, that we were reassured that all the orders that we had were going to be in place over the rest of 2012. So my employees are very, very concerned, even though we're still working 10 hours a day, 2 shifts.
And you indicated earlier that you have never had to lay anybody off, and can I assume that because you're a part of the community that you'll do everything in your power, notwithstanding the devastation that's happening in various parts of the coal industry, to keep all those people employed if you can?
We're going to do everything we possibly can. We could probably cut back to 8 hours a day, 2 shifts, and we're not going to do anything to lay anybody out. Fortunately, we have numerous contracts with other large companies throughout 2012, and we just recently received some orders from the potash industry. They're quite large, so we're trying to get diversified to a point, but our employees are very, very concerned.
All right, I appreciate that. Mr. Nation, you told me earlier, either this year or late last year, that you one time had to tell a group of employees, several hundred, that you were going to have to close down that facility and that you never wanted to do that again. Is that still your desire, to never have to close down a facility?
I have had the unfortunate experience of standing in front of a big crowd of people and telling them that they were losing their job. At that point in time, it was due to poor trade regulations enacted. But it is what I work hardest on every day, is never having to say that again to anybody. And I need the government's help to do it, and I need this thing not to be passed.
You need this not to be passed in order not to have to do that again. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Very much, and we appreciate your all's testimony as well. I might just make a couple of comments. One, we appreciate the work that you do as manufacturers because you're a very large company. Some of these companies are small, but 2 out of every 3 jobs created in America today are still created by small business men and women. And at a time when our economy is struggling and efforts are being made to decrease unemployment, increase employment, we're not making much progress. And the reason Morgan Griffin and many others of us in Washington are having so many hearings, and we are writing letters and meeting with Lisa Jackson and Gina McCarthy and others over at EPA, is that we feel like with the multitude of regulations coming out of EPA at this particular time in our nation's history, our economy is so sluggish, we need to do more to create jobs rather than create obstacles that make it more difficult to create jobs. Right. And one of our witnesses earlier mentioned Region 1 Administrator for EPA, a fellow named Kurt Spalding. I'm not sure if he's still the Region 1 Administrator or not. But 2 days after EPA released its greenhouse gas proposed regulation, he gave a speech at Yale University. And he said this among other things. If you want to build a coal plant, you've got a big problem. You must remember, if you go to West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Kentucky, and other states where communities depend upon coal, you say to those communities, you should go away. And as I said in the very beginning, when EPA goes through these thorough analysis, looking at benefits from proposed new regulations, they inevitably talk about, we're going to stop X thousands of premature deaths. We're going to stop X thousands of hospitalizations. We're going to stop X thousands of heart attacks that they have come up with these numbers through some modeling that they do. And yet, the thing that is so frustrating about it is they never go to the communities where the jobs are going to be lost when they implement the new regulations to determine the cost for that community, those people, and what it means to them and their families when they lose their health care. they talk about the new jobs that are going to be created in the green industries. And they've said recently that they've created 4 million new jobs in green industries. But you know, Morgan, when Darrell Issa had that hearing on the definition of a green job under this administration, we found out that if you are someone working at a service station and you fill up a bus, that's a green job. If you work in an antique store, you're recycling, that's a green job. So the definition of the green jobs has been skewed in such a way that, yeah, you can talk about all the jobs created, but we know when they gave $538 million of taxpayer dollars to Solyndra, to a company controlled by George Kaiser of Oklahoma, who bundled millions of dollars for the president. And by the way, after they received that money, as you know, they went into bankruptcy, but they subordinated the taxpayers of America who provided the money so that they would get their money back after the venture capitalists and the private people got their money back. So this is an administration, in my view, even though they talk about middle-class America, they're not nearly as interested in middle-class America as they say. So thank you all very much for being with us today. And Mr. Griffith, do you have any other questions or comments?
Well, if I could expand on that a little bit, two things. One that I think is extremely important. I know that all of you all want to keep your jobs in the United States if at all possible. What sometimes is forgotten is that if we make our energy costs so high by unreasonable regulations that a company has to send their jobs, either they close down and somebody else in another country starts producing that product, or they have to send their jobs overseas, what then happens is those countries are producing the goods that we used to manufacture here. It might not apply to potato chips, but it certainly applies to Mr. Nation's yarn products. And what happens then is they don't have the reasonable regulations that we already have. So when you send those jobs to Colombia or to India or to China or Kazakhstan, and they don't have those reasonable regulations that we have currently, they put more air pollution into the air. And according to a NASA study, it takes 10 days to get from the middle of the Gobi Desert in China to the eastern shore of Virginia. So what happens is we send our jobs over there because we have policies that make the cost of energy so high that a company can't stay here, and then we get shipped back the air pollution that was the original reason for shipping away our jobs in the first place. If you look at the total picture, it just doesn't make any sense. And you know, I'm reminded by both a bumper sticker and by the facts that we've heard in front of our committee, Ed, that you have gone into in so much detail to make sure that we have all the facts in front of us. And that is the number one indicator for whether or not people have health problems in their community is the poverty level. And so I'm reminded of that bumper sticker that I've seen on a number of vehicles around this district, and that is, if you think coal is ugly, wait till you see poverty. Mr. Chairman, I think it's extremely important that we've heard from these witnesses today, that we've had it open for folks who don't have to travel to D.C. to see what our hearings are like and to understand what we're trying to do. I appreciate that very, very much. I thank you so much for doing that, and I yield back my time.
Well, thank you. In conclusion, I would simply say thank you for coming. It's important that we all be aware of precisely what's going on in Washington and the impact of decisions being made there. I want to once again thank the Southwest Virginia Higher Education Center and all of the people here who helped us put this on. And I tell you what, I found out Morgan Griffith he's a determined fellow because he stayed on us about this hearing, Mary, and we're delighted that we came because it was something that needed to be done. And I want to thank you three witnesses for being with us, as well as those on the first panel. And we look forward to working with all of you to do everything in our power to have more common sense regulations and laws adopted in Washington, D.C. So thank you very much, and that adjourns today's hearing.